It's our pleasure to welcome Emic Mathis from Stanford University, who's going to make our final presentation for the morning. So, Emic, welcome.
I like the frog. Good, Alan.
He called it ball.
In many ways, my presentation is a continuation of what we've already been talking about in the last 30 to 45 minutes, thanks to Vernon. I'm sort of now seeing my presentation as maybe more summative of things that have already been said today. As I was kind of listening to other presentations and mentally checking off things that were in mine, I think there are two things in my presentation that maybe we haven't touched on yet, but everything else in some way we've touched on either explicitly or implicitly. I'm also highly scripted, so I'm not going to change my presentation that much. So just consider it as sort of summative thoughts on the morning. I moved to Birmingham about 2 years ago. And when I moved to Birmingham about 2 years ago, I kind of began to pay attention to what people were doing in Birmingham. And there are two things that everybody does in Birmingham. First, everybody watches football. So I started watching football a little bit more often. The second thing that everybody in Birmingham does is they listen to Rick and Bubba. Rick and Bubba is a morning talk show, and it's everything you might imagine it would be. And I was listening to Rick and Bubba not long ago, shame to admit, and they started using this phrase, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. They were talking about the election, and they kept repeating this phrase over and over again, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And they went on to tell how that's sort of a folk tale about a frog that's actually trying to get out of a well. So the frog is stuck down in the middle of this deep and dark and murky, wet well, and this frog starts trying to climb out, and for every 2 steps forward, the frog makes up the wall. The frog ends up falling at least 1 step backward. Some of you may have heard the saying or expression changed a little bit to say 1 step forward and 2 steps back. While I was listening to that conversation and even thinking about what we're doing here, I started thinking about the well that we're in at Stanford, which is called curriculum revision, and it's the well that we've sort of all been talking about. And I think it's a deep, dark, muddy well that's full of a lot of frogs. And at least for us, it seems as though every step forward we take, we're thrown back another step. Or we might move forward 2 steps, and then we're thrown back again. So we sit and dream about all of our curriculum. We take it to the music faculty, and they say, no, this won't work. Here, make these changes. So we go make the changes. Then we get to administration, and they say, well, is this financially feasible? We don't think so. Go make the changes. So anyway, back and forth, and then on it goes. And by the time we get out of the well, most of the time our curriculum looks nothing like we originally imagined it to be. But our topic this morning is curriculum. And I've given us a question, only one, as opposed to Vernon, who had a lot of questions. And our question is this. As teachers in the university, how do we imagine well-grounded and creative ways to educate and form musicians for the church who will be musically proficient, biblically grounded, theologically astute, historically knowledgeable, culturally savvy, technologically competent, spiritually healthy, and pastorally sensitive? I think those are the things that we've covered here this morning in some ways. We're not going to answer it, but it's good to have those things in front of us. To get at this question, I want to outline kind of 3 frames that might be helpful for thinking. The first 2 especially are going to be summative from what we've talked about today. So the first are some general working assumptions that we might have about musicians in the church and about our curriculum. The second are some present challenges and dangers that I think are facing us, some of which we've named, some we haven't. And the third is ingredients for the holistic training and spiritual formation of pastoral musicians for the church. My content is different, but I've adopted these 3 frames from a presentation that Bert's colleague, John Whippley, gave at a 1998 presentation at Yale University on a very similar topic. So I've adopted those, and I'm going for breadth rather than depth. And again, the first 2 sections are really going to be summative. So I'd like to begin with 6 working assumptions I think we might have. The first we've already said, and that is that musicians in the church must be good musicians and they must be versatile musicians. Today's musical environment is complex, and we know that they have to be fluent in many musical languages. They have to understand the intricacies of Baroque ornamentation. They have to be able to create a lead sheet off of the most recent Hillsong album or the Gungor album and then improvise from it with the band. They have to be able to differentiate between drumming patterns that are present in Pablo Sosa's music or Boniface Ngana's music, global musicians. Second, they have to consistently evolve in their depth and breadth of liturgical intelligence. In other words, they must deeply understand worship in their own liturgical homeland, yet they must also understand worship in traditions that are foreign to their own. So by saying traditions foreign from their own, we might say that those are different denominationally, culturally, geographically, theologically, musically, and on the list goes. Third, musicians in the church should be grounded in the knowledge and study of Scripture, and they should possess a certain level of theological acumen required to interpret Scripture for their local context. And so here I'm saying this, offering the caveat that I think it's our primary job to train theological musicians, emphasizing musicians, rather than musical theologians. But nonetheless, they need to be able to do both. Next, musicians in the church must possess a pastoral sensitivity that contributes to collaborative models of music ministry for the purpose of nurturing discipleship in their faith community and genuinely extending concern, care, grace, and hospitality to all people within and beyond their reach. Much could be said about collaborative models of ministry, but I think for now it's worth acknowledging that gone are the days of church ministry where different ministries functioned as silos, that guarded and protected and separated themselves from one another. Now the model is partnerships in ministry. And also, I think it's important to acknowledge that training disciples in the kingdom is different than training musicians who happen to be disciples in the kingdom. So there's a prioritization there. Fifth, musicians in the church must develop or acquire personal habits that promote the integration of the musical, liturgical, biblical, theological, historical, cultural, technological, and pastoral knowledge they possess alongside the practices that are required of them professionally. This is what Craig Dykstra has called pastoral imagination. He defines it in this way. It's a way of seeing into and interpreting the world which shapes everything one thinks and does. It's an imagination that requires unusual intelligence. It involves specific capacities of mind, spirit, and action that are not only gained during pastoral ministry, but also essential to doing well in pastoral ministry. And the sixth assumption that I offer is actually not that related to musicians in the church. It's more related to our music and worship curricula. Vernon echoed it as well. But that is that the primary goal of music and worship curricula, insofar as any exist, because in some places they don't, the primary goal is to prepare pastorally sensitive musicians who assist the church, local and global, in experiencing the joy and privilege it is to offer worship to God in Jesus Christ by the power of the Holy Spirit so that the kingdom of God can flourish in the world. And I'll just say that this is in direct opposition to curricula that are designed to serve the academic requirements of the university or the personal and professional agendas of its faculty members. So these are our goals, or perhaps assumptions, but they're not easily accomplished because there are a series of challenges that we face. We've hit around the nature of the ecclesial landscape in the last few minutes. Constance Cherry in 2002 wrote an article, and she talked about these three cycles that the church oftentimes goes through, and we've been hinting at it all morning. The first is a time of orientation or settled familiarity. It's the time that you'll hear most church musicians wax about, and eloquently from 1950, the glory days when everything was the same, even though it wasn't. Then churches, congregations tend to go through a period of disorientation and upsetting of the status quo. For society at large, that's the time period we know as the worship wars. In 2002, Constance Cherry asked the question, will the church move on towards reorientation, which is essentially a realignment with what it is that God might be trying to do in the period of disorientation. We're 10 years out from her article, and I think now what we've all been articulating, or what I'm hearing, is that perhaps we've changed from disorientation into reorientation, but we're maybe just beginning that process of reorientation. So as the Alabamians say, we're not out of the woods just yet. There are some other challenges that we face. One is a crisis of aesthetics and a crisis of pluralism. I think they're related. The crisis of aesthetics is essentially when and how we speak of musical taste. We know it well. It sounds like this. Our music is better than your music, and therefore we're superior and you're inferior. But diametrically opposed to that is the crisis of pluralism. And I'm becoming more and more concerned about this, at least with my students, because the crisis of pluralism promotes a laissez-faire attitude about the nature of worship that really leads to a form of liturgical relativism. So it sort of says, you go do your thing, and I'm going to go do my thing, and you'll be fine, and don't mess with us, and we're not going to mess with you. So it promotes that. But I think that's deeply problematic, because the question that it raises is, how do we assess our worship practices? How do we define which worship practices are Christian and which worship practices might not be Christian. The vocational identity of the worship leader we've already named here, but the point is that the grids we could make defining the role or the terminology of the worship leader would confound any mathematician who tried to make permutations out of them. The sacramentality of music is another challenge that faces all of us. Most of our congregations, whether we'll acknowledge it or not, use some kind of sacramental language. The Roman Catholic Church has typically reserved it for the Eucharist. Protestants typically for the Word. The Baptists, Glenn Hinson even said that Baptists have made a sacrament out of the invitation. Nowadays, I think that many congregations have made a sacrament out of music. Ministers in their congregations want worship leaders who can usher them into the presence of God. Some of them believe that this is accomplished through a song set with the band. Others of them through the organ and a beautiful modulation with general piston number 10. John Whibley reminds us that this is a theological issue more than it is a musical one. Cultural issues, we've talked about this, but that is we need desperately musicians who are equipped with skills in liturgical enculturation to balance cultural diversity, promote fully intergenerational worship, which I believe is huge right now, to move beyond cliched marketing ploys about attracting people into their congregations, to use technology in meaningful and engaging ways, and to claim hope in God while also facing the reality that we no longer live in a Christian era. We're in a post-Christian age. Next is the vulnerability of academia. So we're also living in an era of academic transition, and all you have to do is look at book titles that have been written recently about the nature of academia. College, what it was and should be, the fall of the faculty and the rise of the administration, academically adrift, in defense of higher education. We're losing our minds, rethinking American higher education and the innovative university, changing the DNA of higher education from the inside out. Keeling and Hirsch essentially summarize the problem with higher education right now. They say this: our colleges and universities are failing to deliver true higher learning that prepares graduates to meet and excel at the challenges of life, work, and citizenship. We're not developing the full human and intellectual capacity of today's college students because they're not learning enough and because the learning that does occur is haphazard and of poor quality. Metaphorically speaking, we're losing our minds. Also, I'll say that scholarship, I think closely related to the academic crisis, is I would say that there's anemic scholarship in our discipline right now. Though there are certainly exceptions that have been made to that. Dr. Bradley recently released his book. David Music in this room, it writes all the time. But by and large, the number of books and articles out about the nature of music and worship leadership in the church has not been that profound in recent years. So the challenges are real and confrontational, and they leave us wondering really whether there's a way forward. It involves creativity and innovation. We may find it, we may not find it. I'm not sure that what I have to offer will help, but I think that there are some potential things that we can move towards that might help guide our thinking in determining a way forward. The first, Vernon hinted at a moment ago, but it's contextualized rather than standardized curricula. So suppose we take seriously the assumption that, in fact, our music and worship curricula actually exist to serve the local church and not the universities. And so suppose we say that we're going to genuinely celebrate the mosaic of musical and liturgical practices that are offered by different churches around the world, and we start by letting our curricula actually develop outside of the academy rather than inside the academy. And maybe even local practices in the church can become the touchstone as the rubric of assessment that our accreditation agencies might use if we can get them to agree to it. So in other words, if there's congruence between the ecclesial practices of the church or the denominational tradition that the institution is trying to serve, then maybe they're accomplishing their goals rather than matching a set of skills and standards that were set by people who know nothing about the particular denominational tradition in question. Second, means of collaboration through consortiums in higher education. We've talked about this again today, but really, it's opportunities of partnership. And I'll just simply say that we need more events like this one. I would love to see more events like this one where we bring our students to interact with one another, or maybe where we choose best practitioners in our area and we bring them and learn from them. Because the reality is that my students need to learn from David Music about the importance of historical research and how that helps them determine different patterns in their congregations. They need to see Emily Snyder lead a hymn from the organ and turn right around and play the piano or the guitar while she sings Chris Tomlin. They need to interact with Vernon, who has some of the most professional students that I've ever met. And they also need to meet Beverly Howard and talk to her about the ways in which she's engaged in an enormous amount of change in her worship and music setting, yet still maintains a contagious spirit and a beautiful smile. Also, interdisciplinary coursework built on collaborative models of learning, teaching, and scholarship. Essentially, these are courses where historians, theologians, sociologists, and musicians examine together the complex web that worship is, and then begin to teach their students to integrate all of those things together. So for instance, imagine a course on worship leadership in the evangelical tradition. Suppose it was divided into 4 components over a semester. Students started by studying jazz musicianship with someone who specialized in theory. And then they moved on and studied the frontier tradition as a precursor to the praise and worship tradition in more recent years. And they did that with a liturgical historian. Then suppose in another series of weeks they worked on technological competencies required by this tradition with someone who is a specialist in audio and visual technology. And then in the final 2 to 3 weeks of the course they integrated or synthesized all those together as they planned and led and reflected on the practice of worship leadership in that particular tradition. Also, we need pedagogical methods that balance and integrate practice with theory. The Catholic, Edward Foley, said not long ago that this is the greatest crisis facing church musicians training today. And that is that oftentimes we do theory in this sort of unilateral approach where we only tell theories, we don't give students the opportunities to practice. Or conversely, we only say practice, or do without any opportunities for reflection. So our curricula need to promote a better balance of practice and theory. And I would offer the formula that they need to be 2/3 practice-based with theory in the middle. So in that sense, we teach students to first observe practice, then we teach them theory, and then ask them to reappraise the practice in light of the theories that we've taught them. So they're integrating everything together. Also, spiritual and professional formation beyond the classroom prompted by or facilitated by scholar practitioner mentors. The ingredient sort of explains itself, but Father Michael Woods, who teaches a course at Gonzaga, he teaches a course called Sacraments for a Just World. And the way that course works is it exists entirely outside of the classroom during one semester. And it meets once a week for common reading, and then it meets a second time during the week where the students go and lead worship in a homeless kitchen after they've served soup to the people who are there. And they actually help those people also lead worship. So it's not something that the students are just going and doing. I oftentimes ask myself the question, where is that course's equivalent in our music schools? Last, campus worship practices. I think these are non-negotiables, especially for church-related schools. It might be different in the public university where Jonathan is, but at least in church-related schools, I think that we have to have them. Under the right leadership, they can serve as a laboratory for creativity, and it can also provide students with opportunities for spiritual formation and nourishment, where we're teaching them and reminding them of the joy and privilege it is to worship God. At Sanford last year, we started a monthly choral vesper service. It's led by choir and organ, and it was sort of the one liturgical tradition that we didn't have on campus, yet we had this beautiful cathedral of sorts in our seminary. And we said we really need to use that space well. So we started this monthly tradition of choral vespers. It's the first Friday of every month. We're averaging 350 students attending that each month. It's a non-required event. And after our first one that we held this September, I saw a freshman named Josh. Josh is a music and worship major. He plays guitar, leads with a band often, and comes from an evangelical church, a mega church, who has a great tradition in worship. I ran into Josh after this Vesper service that he had sang for, because it was required as part of his choir experience. And I noticed that his eyes were a little bit teary, and I was sort of conflicted. Do I ask him why he's crying or not? Because it's sort of that breach of boundaries. And I chose not to. I just said, "Are you okay?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm fine." And so we talked for a little bit. And then later that night at 11:42 p.m., I received a text from Josh, which is another issue that came so late. But anyway, in that text, this is what he said. It all hit me today. Worship is a greater task than I ever imagined it to be, and God's greatness demands that I worship no matter the time, no matter the place, or no matter the setting. I started learning that lesson tonight. For students like Josh, for ourselves, I hope that we approach our curriculum with Paul's prayer to the Ephesians. The God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, will give us a spirit of wisdom and revelation that makes God known. That the eyes of our hearts will have enough light to see what is the hope of God's call, what is the richness of God's glorious inheritance among believers, and what is the overwhelming greatness of God's power that is working among us believers. And the rest of our time today and tomorrow will help us in our task.
I'm Ron Bowles, and I'm the facilitator for this discussion. And thank you, Eric, for that wonderful presentation. And as you saw and heard, it is a continuation of what Vernon began earlier in the previous session as we consider and talk about some of the questions that all of us are confronting as we look at the curricula that our programs are offering. That's something we're working through, talking to some of my other Texas colleagues here. I know we're all kind of facing our NASM reviews here in the next month or two. Our visit is this coming month, and I know that's true in some other cases. And we're looking forward to that time that visit's beyond us, so then we can grapple with some of these questions once we get into that 10-year review period again. But in light of what Eric has already shared with us, and as we take a few minutes now to consider what topics or areas of curriculum design and study can we grapple with in this brief time. There may be some questions that have already come to mind, or something holding over from the last session that comes to your mind. One thing that I briefly alluded to a while ago that I think is something that's worthy of some discussion and grappling with a little bit is how far do we carry our church music and worship studies curriculum at the undergraduate level. How much should we approach? How much should we try to do? How much should we leave for graduate school and seminary to pick up and take to the student to the next level? I've had conversations, as you have had, with friends, and I've gone blank on his name, formerly at Southwestern Seminary. I'm sorry. No. The dean. It's not Southwestern, Southern.
Tom Bolt.
Price. Milburn came to DVU 5 years ago, as part of our pre-NASM back then, and I asked him the question, what do you feel like should be the main thrust, or what's an important part of the undergraduate church music program? He said the important thing is the strong musical foundations that they get through performance degrees or other kind of programs. Now, he was speaking as a graduate school dean and director, I'm sure. But the same is true at Southern Seminary, where they do not, SNU, where they don't offer a undergraduate church music program. So that's something I would like to hear some conversation about. How far do we carry this? I think we all in this room would probably agree that we need to offer it. Our students are coming to us, and many are saying to us, I'm not sure I'm going on to seminary. Or if I go on to seminary, I'm not sure I'm going to be going on further in music. I want something in divinity, or something in missions, or something else. So how far are we responsible in their preparation and readiness for ministry in music and business? So I kind of throw that out.
Yes, along with students, I was a music department chair. I would tell them, if you think you want to major in music, you better go ahead and start out that way. But just because you major in music doesn't mean you're going to be in music as a career. That many times they will often did other things, same thing with church music. So, but they're going to probably use that in their local church either as a volunteer or part-time person. So there's another dimension to it as well.
I thought it was interesting. This is a different subject, but it's number 6 here on this, and it was mentioned a moment ago about chapels and those kind of campus. I don't know about anybody else, I got the impression that there's not a big connection. We have more of a connection now, I think, than we had, maybe Randall, when you were there, I don't know, when you, but chapel does not belong to the music department. Now, when I was in seminary, chapel belonged to the music department, it is chapel music, but at OBU it belongs to, it used to be campus ministry, now it's the Dean of Spiritual Life. They own chapel and chapel experiences, and we are there at their invitation to participate. I always see it as a field opportunity on campus, and yet it's very limited because chapels tend to also be speakers' forums. They are not full-blown worship services. And so we have to, what do we do with that? And how do we help the students? You know, it's not, we don't get these free-form chapel experiences to do what we would want with them. That's all part of a combination of other things, and it's not really connected to curricula, to the faculty. It's not really connected to anything that goes on in the classroom. So I'm not providing the answer here, but I think it is a part of this equation. I don't know how many of you are really connected to what goes on musically or in any other way with the chapel services. You are. I am only as I am invited, and I try to get me out of it as much as possible. I try to get students up there as much as possible. Occasionally, it gets messy.
That initially was a challenge for me when I started at Stanford. One of the things that I did, though, as part of the class, because I believe that as an introduction to worship leadership class, I believe that students have to practice worship leadership in that component rather than just talking about it. So we initiated a Sunday night worship gathering that started at 9 p.m. We agreed upon a time together, and that class did every other Sunday night, and they were responsible for inviting their friends and whatnot. And it was always geared towards the start of the week. And that became just a little environment that we sort of created that was part of the students' project to create. And by the end of that, we had pretty decent attendance, and it was all about praying for the week and a time of worship. And that ended up being a successful endeavor for us and a very deep learning experience.
Yeah, we're doing something similar, although it's not said on a regular basis, but Hardin-Simmons is allowing alternative chapels, and students can get chapel credit for going to a variety of things. So we've built in some worship services in the class, worship leadership class, which the students prepare. They invite friends, they publicize it, the students get chapel credit for it, and it's that's the way that we are involved, because our chapel service is the same thing. They're a speaker forum. So, but by allowing giving alternative chapel credits for an actual worship service, we're encouraging students on campus to be involved in those.
Do any of your institutions offer chapel credit for
Yes.
general students attending choral programs,
Yes.
Christmas celebrations? We don't. I love that idea.
Yes.
To get more students engaged, because the public comes, but the student body doesn't.
Yeah, all of our concerts, even the theater department, their plays, all of that is chapel credit.
One semester opportunity to do that, multiple semesters.
Multiple semesters.
I saw 2 questions. Yes, sir.
Eric, your first guiding question, you listed 8 items. Seems to me anyone in our earlier discussions about what should be the curriculum that I've contextualized, standardized. However, this is a wonderful place to start. Then you can do the NASM kind of thing. You can say, okay, how much of any one of these 8 actually happens in a course that has a name and a number and 3 credits or the standard curriculum stuff? Which of these things, or perhaps even all of them, in some ways happen in co-curricular or extracurricular things? If you take a course, if you take a major in physics, you're required to do math as a cognate. Well, stuff like how do you produce a church drama or run a church art gallery for people who basically get degrees some stuff has to happen. But I think the program has to be designed ultimately like a checklist. You take these courses, but you take these other kinds of experiences, like cognates. And if you've never seen a handbell outfit, you've got to go for a semester and sit in on the handbell choir. If you've never crashed a soundboard or fixed feedback or whatever, then you better go, room with someone who can help you fix that. So it's a mix, I think, of formal curricular stuff and then these more informal but required experiences. And there's one thing that came up earlier, and that's a question for you from us. We got to connect the dots. Somewhere along the line, and not just at the end in a capstone, but throughout, I think there have to be some sort of integrative kinds of things. Again, that might not necessarily be a course. It might simply be that part of your degree is you're going to volunteer in a job program or at a church or some other ways. I think very specific courses, and I would suspect in this room, it wouldn't take us that long to come up with 5 or 6 or maybe even 10 that we would say, absolutely, those have to be there. We'd have a little longer discussion on what I've called the cognate kind of stuff. Now again, I would think a number of us would say, well, if you don't do that in the course, you've got to do it somewhere. So we'll design X to do it. And then that integrative feature of it.
Jonathan, did you have a comment?
Yeah, we have a kind of interesting, I think I'm the only one here from a public university where we don't have capital services university-wide. But we do have many active large campus ministries that are directly just on the campus. So I see potential there for coordinating practices with those pastors, many of whom music faculty already know. But the trouble in our situation is that those who are majoring in church music, because it's a public school, already have sought out the parish and the community in their own tradition, and almost all of them are already active as players, singers, or whatever in those situations, and virtually never are they actually in control of what happens. They're there as a volunteer or as a paid staff singer or whatever. So we lose, I think, a lot of opportunity for that kind of coordinated education and those kind of contextual experiences, because the main time when we have to do that, Sunday mornings, is already taken by the parents in the parish.
I have a question. If we were to be able to teach our students everything they need to know to succeed as a worship leader, worship pastor right now in today's church, in 10 years, much of that will be obsolete, or if history proves out, that would be most of the contextually based stuff. My question, it's an impossible task to teach them everything they're going to need to know for their career. How do you build into the student the mindset that education is a lifelong process? It does not end at the commencement of even a graduate. How do we, as educators, build into them that mindset if they've got to keep at this their whole life?
We model it, first of all.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah, I thought about this earlier when we were discussing Vernon's presentation. I think it's tied to this, teaching our students how to help congregations manage the process of change. Because even what, with an updated curriculum, if a student, a worship student, becomes a worship leader and serves a long tenure in that career, in that vocation, things are going to change. The music's going to change. The culture's going to change. The contexts are going to So I think that's a part of the dynamic of what we have to be prepared to help our students learn how to do it.
We started our program committing ourselves not to teach stylistic preference. The moment I've had several people over the years come over and say, well, how do you teach this kind of song, and how do you teach that? And I said, we don't. Now, the students will apply it to whatever they know and understand, but we've just basically intentionally disciplined ourselves to stay focused on teaching biblical philosophies and principles of worship. And it's working for us. Now, the methods courses obviously are a little different, but I think that's where we began. And I teach the freshmen, and I do it with a great deal of passion. And we spend 3 weeks just dealing with the issue of calling. Why calling is so critical, what they do. And I asked them the question the very first day. I said, how many of you in here want to be famous? You know, raise their hand, and I said, this is the wrong class for you, because we're going to make Jesus famous. And then they kind of back away, but it's an issue that's important to us. And I think therein is probably the beginning place.
I think we, for the sake of time, need to stop here. Randall, do you have some instructions here for us?
Our instructions for